Hey, what's going on, y'all? Evan here. I just created a custom Claude MCP connector for Flyletter, my AI newsletter writing app that lets you use Flyletter directly inside Claude. Now, I think this is not only a differentiator, but actually a necessity if you're building a web app in 2026 and beyond, because we're moving towards a future where most people will access your app via a custom or personal agent and maybe not even see your interface. And so you need to make sure that it is ready to accept those agents on behalf of your users. And the easiest way to start doing that is by building a custom Claude connector that allows your users to use your product directly inside Claude, both reading information from your app as well as writing things to your app. Now, of course, you can have Claude walk you through the setup for most of this, but I ran into multiple pitfalls that I had to overcome in order to get this thing live and working. And so I'm going to walk you through my exact process, including those pitfalls and how to overcome them so you don't run into the same issues. Some of this stuff is just going to be the right prompts to tell Claude to set these things up for you, but it also requires some elbow grease. So let's get after it. Okay, so a custom Claude MCP connector is essentially a separate web server that Claude connects to. And what it does is it hosts tools. And what tools are the data, information, and capabilities you want to give Claude access to. And so when a user calls your product inside Claude or Claude Cowork, what it's essentially doing is calling and connecting with this separate MCP connector that only has the tools, aka the capabilities and data you want to give Claude access to. Once it's connected, come over here to connectors and then over here to customize. Now here is all of the connectors that I have. Of course, there are some official ones like Slack, Microsoft 365, whatever, but you can also create custom connectors as well. And so you see here, this is the Flyletter custom connector. I'll scoot my face over here. There you go. And you'll see that it has both read-only tools and then also write tools as well, meaning that Claude can basically read the data in Flyletter as well as write data to Flyletter given specific parameters that I've given it. And each one of these is a tool, and each of these tools lives on the MCP server and is the only thing that Claude can access. Now, as a user, I have the ability to set access or permission levels. So I can block this stuff myself. I can always have it require approval, or I can always allow. Now, unfortunately, this is a per user setting. So if you're creating an MCP connector, it's important when you're giving instructions to your users to set it to always allow. This will let the user use your web app in Claude seamlessly and not require saying yes to permissions each time. However, it's up to them. And if they want to make sure they're approving everything, or if they even want to block certain information from getting from your app to Claude, they can do it. And then just to show you how this works for Flyletter, what Flyletter does is captures your unique brand voice to help you write newsletters and social posts. However, you can use that brand voice directly in Claude to write pretty much anything. So if you need to write sales emails, emails to your boss, website copy, whatever, you can port in your brand voice profile from Flyletter and use it to write. So to do so, I can just use the Evan Tarver persona and write me a sales email. So what you'll see here is Claude thinking. Now he's searching for the tools that I just showed you. And now it's reasoning through. It is asking me, let's just say a cold prospect, whatever, book a call. And it'll go ahead and write. Now, what it can also do is, this is the read access. So it's pulling information into Claude and then using that to do things within Claude, but can also write to Flyletter, meaning it can push data and write data into Flyletter. And so one example of that is Flyletter also helps you capture newsletter ideas, develop those ideas, and then write about them at a future date. So if you're in Claude working and you have a great newsletter idea, you don't want to go flip over to Flyletter to save it. You can just essentially use Flyletter as your database. Go ahead and say, hey, I want to save this idea. It'll go ahead and save it. And then when you go over to Flyletter to write your newsletter, it'll be there ready for you to go. So that's how it both reads and writes. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is actually create the Claude MCP server in your project files for your web app. And that's what's going to connect to the off-platform web server on what I use as Railway, and I'll show you how to do that. So in order to do that, you literally just create an MCP folder and then include in that folder, candidly, things that I don't even know. I'm not technical, but this is where you can ask Claude to do so. But it's important that, one, you have a separate folder for this MCP connector. And then crucially, it's important that each user who uses the MCP connector, it creates a new instance. The issue I first ran into is the way it was originally set up by instructions with Claude was to have multiple users using the same MCP connector instance, and then essentially broke the MCP connector. So I'll show you basically how to prompt Claude Code to build this folder the right way. But if you see here on the left-hand side, I have an MCP server folder. This is in Replit. I guess maybe I'm still insane. I'm using Replit as my dev site, including using Claude Code in here. And if I open up the MCP server folder, you'll see all the things that need to be added basically to that MCP server. Now, the good thing is you don't have to do it yourself. You can ask Claude Code to set it up for you. I'm over here in my shell, and in the bottom here, I have this exact prompt. You can get this prompt in the write-up on my Substack, but essentially this will tell Claude Code to set up the MCP folder correctly so it can connect to Railway and do what we need it to do. Now, like I mentioned, it's important that you make sure it's a per request and closes when the response ends, because if it doesn't do it per request, again, that'll be when multiple users are trying to use the same MCP server connection, and essentially the MCP connector will fail. So when you're setting it up, make sure you use this prompt that denotes that it's a per request per user and closes when the response ends and returns a healthy status. So that will just make sure that it's set up correctly. Okay, with that done, the next step is to actually set up your MCP server in your hosting platform for your web app. For me, that's Railway. It's what I recommend if you haven't even set up hosting yet. It's really easy to create a separate server and then connect it to your main repo. So what you just did was set up that folder in your project files, then you push that to your GitHub. Now, because I already have this set up here in Railway, I'll just basically show you how it's done. But if you come over here to MCP, the first thing you need to do is set up a new project, which will be the Flyletter MCP, and then make sure in your variables that you're connecting the correct variables that it needs to operate. So as an example, it needs to access the database. It needs to be able to log in users. I use Clerk login for that. So anything that your MCP connector needs access to needs to be added here into the variables, which is going to be at least some of the exact same variables in your main server. So you see here, I have a bunch of variables in the main server, but we don't need all of these because we're not giving Claude access to every capability. It's just the things that we need Claude to have access to in order to access the tools, as well as like log in the user. So if you come over here back to variables, you see that it's much fewer. Here you can just ask Claude, what variables do I need to add? And it'll add it for you, or at least tell you what to add. And they're all going to be in your main Railway production server anyway. The next thing you want to do is in your root directory, make sure it's MCP server. So it knows it's an MCP server. And then down here, you want to make sure in public networking that you generate a domain that is mcp.yourdomain.either .io or .com. And then make sure that it's communicating with your project files. So it should look like this when it's set up and connected correctly. But what you're essentially doing here is generating a domain that Claude will use when it's trying to connect with your tools. It'll follow that domain. The domain leads here, pointing at this server, and then it'll be able to access the tools you want it to. Again, here, if there's any confusion, I would just go ask Claude how to set it up. It's quite easy, but just make sure that you're doing it correctly so it's talking together and that you set up the project files in your web app correctly. Okay, now that the project files or the MCP server in your project is talking to the MCP server in Railway, you want to make sure that your users can actually access their account when they set up the custom Claude connector in Claude. And the way they do that is they just use whatever your normal sign-in flow is, and you just got to make sure that that sign-in flow is connected to Claude via your MCP server and custom MCP connector. So for me, I use Clerk, and it's very simple. All you need to do is go to Clerk into your OAuth applications, and then make sure that dynamic client registration is on. That will allow people to sign up to their Clerk account or to their web app account for your web app, but sign up through Claude. So it's basically the same sign up flow. They're just going to sign in using their email and password, or if it's like Google Auth or whatever, to sign in with their Gmail account. But this will allow them to actually sign in Claude and access their account in your web app. Once you have that set up, you want to come back here to whatever you use in Claude Code, whether it's a terminal or the shell here in Replit, and you want to paste this prompt, which again is in the write-up on my Substack, so feel free to check it out there. And what that's essentially doing is adding that Clerk login or that authorization login to your project files in the MCP connector so that it's going to be able to log in when a user sets up your custom connector in Claude. Okay, awesome. With that set up, you basically have the infrastructure. You now have the project files set up correctly with the MCP server. You have the actual external MCP server set up on Railway. Those two are talking to each other. And now you've set up your login successfully. So when someone logs in to their account via Claude to access the connector and then use your tool inside Claude, they're going to be able to do so and sign up or log in with the correct account. Okay, with all that infrastructure set up, you're ready to actually add the tools that you want Claude to use to your MCP server. Now, the way I recommend doing this is first focus on the tools or data that you want Claude to be able to read from, meaning it can pull in the data information into Claude. However, that doesn't mean that it can then write back to your app, meaning add data or make changes to the user's instance in your web app, basically. The reason for this is allowing Claude to write data to your app is a little more complicated. It's also a little more brittle. You want to make sure that it's actually only writing the correct things and not breaking anything. But read is much easier because it's only retrieving data. It's not necessarily adding data to your app. So focus on the read-only tools first, and then you can focus on the write tools. You'll see here that basically what I've done is added tools for every action that I want Claude to be able to take on the behalf of the user. And then I'll show you later if you need to basically give Claude instructions on how to use each of those tools, or crucially, how to basically use a combination of tools to achieve whatever the user's result is that they want to achieve. You can do so by creating a compose layer, but I'll get into that separately. And it's not required if you just need Claude to be able to use just like the individual tools one by one, or if the tools is something as simple as like grab this data, which it doesn't really need instruction information on how to do. But for Flyletter, because it's basically reproducing your brand voice, it actually needs to rebuild the brand voice based off of all the inputs inside of Flyletter, and then also understand how to actually then use your brand voice in Claude. And so for that reason, we have a compose that puts together all of the brand profile components and how to use it to ensure that the brand voice has high fidelity, not only in Flyletter, but then also in Claude. So to do that is fairly straightforward. Really, it's just you identifying the things, the tools, the data that you want Claude to have access to, and then basically telling Claude Code what those capabilities and tools are, and then also a naming convention if you want one, or you can have Claude Code come up with a naming convention itself. And what it will look like on the back end is what I showed you here, basically. And so all you need to do is paste this prompt into Claude Code and then give it a little bit of instructions on the type of capabilities, information, and tools you want Claude to have access to. And it will actually create those tools, those naming conventions, and then add them to your MCP server so that when Claude connects to your app, it can access those tools and then only those tools. It's a little more simple with the read tools. So start there. And then once you've proven that those work, you can move on to the write tools. And again, I have this prompt in the Substack article, so check it out if you're trying to do this step by step. Okay, so we're almost done. Now, another pitfall that I ran into is user login. And so when I set up the Claude MCP connector originally, it looked like it worked, it felt like it worked for me, but broke for other people. And so once you're at this point, when you have the tools set up in your MCP connector, something that I learned the hard way and you should do is have Claude Code verify that your users can actually log in. Obviously, it will be a terrible experience if you say you have a connector and then they can't access it. So basically, by adding this shared helper, it'll just ensure that Claude is accessing the right user and user ID and then returning that correctly. So it's actually connecting to the user's account. And then what Claude Code will do is then add all of your tools to the shared helper just to verify that each one works for your user. And then you can just keep it built this way because it'll just ensure that moving forward, each tool will be directly accessible by each user for their specific account with their specific data. And then another thing I learned the hard way is there's a 25,000 context token limit when using Claude. And so because Flyletter is an AI agent or a suite of AI agents, there's a lot of information and data that we're pushing into Claude in terms of the prompts and how to think about the voice and how to execute on the voice, et cetera. And so you might run into issues where if you're pushing more than 25,000 tokens of context, it'll break the MCP connector and won't work. And so you need to make sure that it's one, under that limit, or two, make sure that it's truncating the information effectively so it doesn't break. Now, ideally, you don't want to send truncated data, truncated information. So you want to make sure that you're under that 25K context limit for each of the tools that you're calling. But just to make sure it doesn't break, you can do this. And so all you got to do is add this prompt down here. And so just make sure that it truncates correctly. And then also, hey, letting the user know this is truncated if you want to actually get all the information go into the app. As an example, if I was pulling like a 40,000 word newsletter, I don't know why you would do that. It wouldn't be able to pull all of that newsletter. And so it would be truncated, but then it would say, hey, go check out Flyletter for the complete newsletter. So I've never ran into this issue, but it will cause an error if it exceeds that limit without this. So just make sure you do it. Okay, so you basically validated that your MCP connector works. It has the right tools. You verified that your users can log in. And then you made sure that if anything is truncated, it's not going to break. And so now it's actually time to connect it to Claude directly, which is perhaps the easiest part. And then also test. Remember, we can go back and do the right tools next. But right now, let's just make sure it works. Obviously, Flyletter is already connected, but all you need to do is add this custom URL that you created in Railway. This connects directly to that MCP server on the Railway app and will allow Claude to log in via your normal login and then let the user access their data and information. So quite literally, you come up here to this button right here, you can add connector and then add custom connector. And then basically you can name it. This is where you add that remote MCP server URL. And because of the way we set up our login earlier, we don't need to add these advanced settings. So you can leave those blank. But in order to find that URL, again, all you need to do is come over here to your MCP connector. And in your public networking, you'll see the URL. And then all you need to do when you add it, I'll leave it here, is grab that URL and then put a /MCP at the end. And that will allow it to connect to the MCP server. And then once you build this out and then add, you will have your custom connector live. And then all you need to do is have your users do the same thing. So you have to give them that URL right here and then give them the instructions, because they'll have to do this themselves because it's custom, to name it whatever they want. Obviously, it can be Flyletter or whatever. And then also adding that correct URL. What will happen when they click add is it'll prompt them to log into their account through your normal auth flow. Once they log in, they'll have access to all of the read tools that you've set up. The next step is to add your write tools. Okay, so adding your write tools is actually much the same way you add your read tools. All you need to do is tell Claude, what I would do is tell Claude what you're looking to achieve, what you want Claude to be able to write to your app, and then have it come up with a prompt that you then give to Claude Code. And then once that's set up, you'll see that we have one write tool, and that is the save idea, like I just mentioned, whereas the read tools is all about pulling in the brand profile and brand persona information, as well as accessing things like information on ideas and information on newsletters. Okay, now that's pretty much it. If you just want Claude to use individual read tools and individual write tools, and also just giving it the leeway to come up with the combination of those, using those tools together for your user based on the user prompts. However, if you want to give Claude information on how and like why to use each of these tools, when to use each of these tools, as well as how to orchestrate multiple tools together, you do need to create an orchestration layer that basically tells Claude how to use those tools together, which tools to use, etc. So as an example for Flyletter, because each of the brand profile details is a separate file, including like how to read and then use the brand profile because it is a JSON. If we give Claude the leeway to just call the tools that it wants, it's not going to actually reconstruct the user's brand voice effectively in Claude. And then you get basically bad output, and then the user thinks it sucks when really it's just the way it was orchestrated that sucks and not the actual brand voice itself. And so what you can do is create what's called a compose layer. And that compose layer tells Claude exactly how to use these different tools together, or when, why, and how to use each of these tools, so that it's going to become like smarter and more effective at actually like accessing the data on behalf of the user and then writing stuff to your app on behalf of the user. And so to do so, you need to create this internal compose routes file, which basically tells Claude how to do this all together. Now, of course, you can just ask Claude for the right prompt to give to Claude Code, but I do have it here already. So all you need to do is add this prompt and it will create that internal compose routes. So Claude knows how to orchestrate multiple tools together, or information on how, why, and when to use each of these tools individually. Super important if you want the user to be able to use your app effectively and not just like a one-off point and shoot, here's this tool, I just need this specific piece of data. That would be easy enough to use without this orchestration layer. But if you are going to be combining these tools together into like one bigger feature, or you want to give Claude information on how to use each of your individual tools, this is super important and helpful. This is what another pitfall. I didn't have this, and the writing output in Claude candidly sucked and did not live up to the brand profile and the brand voice in Flyletter. Once we added this orchestration layer, it understood how to use all of the tools together to essentially rebuild and then use that brand voice profile. And the output candidly 10x and is now on par with Flyletter. Okay, and once you have that routes file set up, so Flyletter knows how to use your individual tools, you do need to add 2 additional variables to your MCP server on Railway to make sure that it can actually call that file and use it effectively. The first one is the internal service secret. Now, you can just create your own secret. You don't need to get it from anywhere. Best practice is like a 32 character hex string. And then all you need to do is then tell Claude Code what that secret is, and it will update it in your project files, which then connects the shared helper to your MCP connector. Now, I would say technically maybe this isn't best practice for security because you don't want Claude Code to know what your secret is in case it like leaks out. So you can also just add it manually to your project files yourself. So I just want to mention that. And then the other thing is just adding the Flyletter app URL as well. So that will make sure that it's able to call this shared helper or file that you created. Okay, that's pretty much it. You have set up the infrastructure for your Claude MCP connector. You set up your read tools. You validated that it works. You then set up your write tools. And then if necessary, you created that compose orchestration layer to make sure Claude knows how to use multiple tools together, or information on how to use each of these tools individually so it's best for your user. If you have any questions or comments, would love to hear from you. Would also love to see what you build. So after you do so, let me know.